And welcome to our seminar on the personal aspects of living overseas as an accompanying partner. My name is Anthony Toffoli, and I'm the director and one of the co-founders of Spouses Without Borders. I've also been on many foreign assignments with my wife and my 3 boys. We created Spouses Without Borders to support our community. Our goal is to empower our community, the spouses of foreign assigned employees, both from government and private sectors, and this also includes the NGO sectors. We do this through education, advocacy, and by linking our global community. The level of support provided to accompanying spouses is generally considered to be inadequate. There are many issues in front of us, such as managing your property while you're living overseas, income tax, preparing income tax when you're living overseas, raising third culture children, health care issues, and so on. There are many stresses that can be experienced as a result of living overseas. They include depression, anxiety, abuse, addictions, marital problems, raising third culture kids. If you've ever had to deal with a rebelling teenager, you'll know what I mean. How do you know that you or a friend is in need of help? How do you know where to turn when you're living overseas and you don't have your network that you've relied on back home? What kind of challenges have you experienced after accepting this lifestyle of living overseas? What are some of the tips and best practices to avoid some of the hurdles of living overseas? Who can you turn to in a time of need? There are many questions. I am joined today by Kathryn Dunlop. She is a retired Canadian International Development Officer who has had many foreign assignments with her family. We're also joined by Isaac Goodine, who has worked with many organizations, including Foreign Affairs, the World Bank, and also with the military. And he has a vast experience with his family of living overseas. And we're also joined by Cathy Lumsden, an Ottawa-based psychotherapist, an author, and an international speaker. In the seminars we organize, we like to turn to experts like Cathy to help us understand the complex issues that we face. The discussion that we are having today is informed by a recent focus group that we had in one of our settings, what we call a Spouses Without Borders coffee morning, where a group of us got together to discuss the issues that are important to us. We are hoping that we can create dialogue and allow people to see that they're free to discuss these. There are issues that affect everyone. Let's start by looking at some of the issues of living overseas for families and how vulnerable we can be. Kathryn, what do you think?
Thanks, Tony. When we met with our members here in Ottawa, everyone agreed that the lifestyle that we pursue, although it has its many rewards, it also has many challenges. Challenges for individuals, challenges for families, and challenges especially for accompanying spouses. Part of it has to do with our expectations. When we go on an overseas assignment, we're generally very excited. That's because we are by nature adventurous people. That's why we pursue this lifestyle. And it's that spirit of adventure that can help see us through the difficult times. But sometimes we're surprised, especially on our first assignment, just how difficult it can be and just how many challenges there are. For our members, when we met them here in Ottawa, their overwhelming priority was their children, the welfare of their children. This isn't surprising because as parents, they feel extremely responsible for the welfare of their children. They want their children to be happy. And sometimes children do experience adjustment issues. They're far from their communities, from their family and their friends. Their education's being disrupted. There are sometimes risks, medical and security. They're definitely pushed out of their comfort zone. And sometimes they react to that. Our members especially pointed out that teenagers, adolescents, can be very vulnerable. When we are on an assignment, we're often far from family and friends. Some of us have elderly parents, and we're trying to oversee their care and their welfare from a distance. And when we're far from family and friends, it's not just an issue of socializing. It's also an issue of intimacy, because it's those friends and family who we've depended on for support. They are our confidants, and now we're without them. The working spouse often becomes quickly immersed in the workplace, and the children can become immersed in school. And it is the accompanying spouse who's often left at home with the boxes. And while we're on that subject, the department or the employer often expects that the accompanying spouse will look after all things personal, will look after settling the family in and settling the children in. And this can be a monumental task, and it largely goes unrecognized. And living overseas in an expatriate community can be like living in a fishbowl. The line between your personal life and your private life is often blurred. And you're no longer a private citizen, so to speak. You're now a representative either of the department or the company. And everything that you do, everything that you say, the way that you dress, this is all examined according to you now as a public representative. And what can be especially difficult about that is that because you're concerned about problems becoming public, you won't speak up. You won't seek the help that you might need. And part of that is because you're afraid that if personal problems become public, that it could affect the career prospects of your partner. Along the same line as a spouse, you can lose your own sense of identity. As we've talked about it before in other seminars with Spouses Without Borders, it's very difficult to obtain employment, even if you have stellar credentials, even if you have an excellent employment record. And everything that you do is often also subject to the approval of your spouse's employer, whether or not you get a job, do volunteer work, write a blog, or want to start a business. That is subject to approval. You are in a foreign country and you may well experience culture shock. Sometimes you don't understand and you don't speak the local language. All the institutions and services that you may be accustomed to are now different. The medical system, the legal system, the police, the education system. You often can't get either the products or services that you're accustomed to, and this can be very frustrating. Sometimes it's as minor as not being able to find a yoga class, but sometimes it's very major, like not being able to find a speech therapist for your child. For the first time in your life, you might have household help. And in some countries, the household help will actually live in your home. At first glance, this looks like a real bonus, but in fact, for many Canadian families, it can be a source of stress. We're not used to this particular dynamic, and we're not accustomed to having live-in help. There's frequently a lot of socializing when you're overseas. And as a spouse, you may be expected to attend a lot of evening events. Some of them are interesting, but some of them are fairly onerous. And in some cases, you might feel excluded when you're attending these events. You don't know, you're not within the work circle, and you find it, you don't know anybody, and you can find it very difficult. There's also the presence always of alcohol and additional stresses that come from this socializing that include substance abuse and sometimes infidelity and marital issues. And we haven't even touched upon the special problems that, say, same-sex couples or reconstituted families or international families might face when they're on an assignment. The biggest surprise for most of us is that coming back to Canada can be as or more stressful than going out in the first place. I'd like to turn the discussion now over to Cathy Lumsden, our psychologist that's with us today, so she can talk a little bit about stress. How do you recognize stress in yourself? how can you possibly prevent stress? And what strategies can you use to kind of navigate through difficult situations? So over to you now, Cathy.
Yes, as Anthony said earlier, the consensus that we often find is that trailing spouses are feeling very vulnerable, and they're also realizing that there's not a lot of resources for them. And one of the things we're hoping Spouses Without Borders provides is a really tight support network on many different levels. I too was a trailing spouse. I moved with my husband and gave up my private practice, sold my beautiful log house, moved down with the kids, and it was an exhilarating, fun time, but there was a huge amount of stress, major issues that often go with a trailing spouse. One of the articles I've been reading recently was looking at the conscientious spouses versus unconscientious spouses. It was Harvard Business Journal. And basically what they were finding was that conscientious spouses significantly contribute to their husbands' or wives' income, different job postings, and job satisfaction, because they're taking care of all the details at home. And therefore, the person who is hired can just do their job. And at 50% significance in, as I mentioned, the job income, different satisfaction and promotions. So this really piqued my interest, because what I find is that the trailing spouse feels inferior. And with this sort of research, it really helps them hopefully learn that they need to honor and respect how much they're contributing to their partner's success, and to learn to be able to value what they're doing at home and with the kids. Another study by the Human Resources Development International, it was actually called Being Dumped In to Sink or Swim. They basically looked at spouse and family adjustment and how that contributed to the overall international assignment success. And obviously, once again, needless to say, it is extremely significant. What they also found in this study was that professional support and social support were the two important things for trailing spouses. So professional support would be trying to help them get a job, and social support is helping them mitigate all the stresses that come with moving to a different country, supporting their spouse. So basically, all this research is really starting to blossom and reach out to trailing spouses who need a lot more support than they're actually getting. All the onus is on the employee, the person who has the posting, and they tend to sometimes, not always on purpose, the family is left to sink or swim. So from a psychological point of view, there's a lot of issues that happen. There's divorce and separation because of the stress. There's burnout, depression, anxiety, substance abuse, overworking, underworking, all sorts of different ways people learn to cope. And I just briefly want to talk a little bit about the fact that knowing what your emotional makeup is extremely important. And what do I mean by that? Well, I'm talking more on the old patterns that every single one of us learn as very young children. We learn coping styles between the ages of 0 and 7, actually. And some of the more common ones are, some of us become pleasers, some of us have a need to control, some people just avoid, I don't want to deal with it, ostrich, and other people come across as superior and have a real strong need for order. There's no right, wrong about this. It's just that we learn them, but they don't always work. For example, a pleaser can very readily burn out because they're so concerned about everybody else's needs and they're not concerned about theirs. Someone who has a need to control because they're getting stressed, whether it's a trailing spouse or if it's the spouse with the position, that can cause a lot of arguments. And actually, in some cases, it does turn to domestic violence, unfortunately. And you're stuck. You're stuck in another country not knowing where to go or who to turn to. So how do you know that you're possibly getting into some of these symptoms? Well, isolating yourself and withdrawing is often one of the first signs. Insomnia or oversleeping, very common as well. Substance abuse, alcohol and drugs, difficulty focusing, loss of energy, memory loss. These are all different signs that maybe perhaps you should seek some support, whether it's through a friend or whether it's through counseling. I counsel many people across the ocean, couples who are struggling, people who are dealing with these different issues. And when they just have someone to reach out to who is not going to be telling anybody else, that's a lifeline. And hopefully Spouses Without Borders can provide that as well. So what are some of the tips for dealing with stress? First, knowledge is power. So as I spoke, know your emotional makeup. Number 2, network. Get involved with people outside of the employee's position. When I was living in a different country, I got involved in a cooperative babysitting club, which was great. I got to meet other moms with other kids, and we would take turns babysitting each other's children. I took courses. Tip number 3 on that note is, what are your innate talents and strengths that you just have? Maybe you can't use them because you're not working, but you can use them in other areas. If you're somebody who likes to problem solve and brainstorm, how can you use that? How can you teach, go into teach in schools? How can you possibly write about it? Using your innate talents and strengths really helps you fill yourself up and not lose your own identity. Speaking of losing your identity, in our coffee meeting, we also talk strongly about keeping your own bank accounts and credit cards so that when you do come back to your original country, you have an identity. One woman was talking about having to come back ahead of her partner to find a home. She had no credit rating. It was impossible. So there are all the different struggles. These are all the different battles that people go through when they're trying to either go abroad or returning home. How do we know what these patterns are? This is the other tip, is think about your thinking. Our thoughts create our feelings. Okay? So we create those thoughts. Our mind's job is to think, right? Think, 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 think. So we create these thoughts so we can uncreate them. But first of all, you have to know what they are. So take some time, journal, get to know what some of your negative thinking is that are coming from some of the old patterns and causing you to please or control or avoid, for example. And then the last tip is perspective taking. Learn and teach your children how to see things from a different perspective. For example, if you're a pleaser and you're wanting so much to please your partner, and you also have an expectation that they're going to be extra attentive or extra affectionate to you, and they're not because they're overworking, well, be aware of how you're seeing that situation. For example, I'm thinking of a woman that I worked with. Her husband was supposed to call her at lunch. He didn't call her. So not only was she feeling depressed and isolated, she started to make up all these negative stories of why he wasn't calling. Well, what's a different way to look at it? Okay, what's a different perspective? Well, maybe he lost his cell phone, or maybe he was dragged into a meeting in the last minute and he didn't know. What's the different way of looking at it? Now, the main reason that you do that is so that you can just calm yourself down. And then when you do get to speak to your partner, you can do it in a more assertive way. You can get your point across. This means very much to me. That connection to you every day at lunch is really important. How can we make it work? But when we're emotionally triggered, it doesn't always come across that way. And I'd just like to end on a note about children. And Ike and I are going to be talking about this in a little bit more depth shortly. But the biggest thing I'd like to say with regards to children is they're going to have their own stresses going abroad or going to a different country. And the best thing you can do is listen. We have 2 ears and 1 mouth. The more you can empathize and listen, the easier their transition's going to be. So that's it for now.
So Isaac, we were talking about maybe coming up with some best practices and talk about that. And one of the things that you mentioned to me the other day was a practice that was done many years ago that you experienced, where spouses were actually brought in very early on, actually before the posting, and were interviewed. Can you share some of that experience with us?
Yes, indeed. I had an experience. The project was called the Kenya Technical Teachers Project. It was quite a long time ago, and it involved taking a number of Canadians, in fact, quite a large number ultimately, to work for 2 to 5, in some cases they stayed 5 years.
Okay.
So actually it ended up that families were coming to live in a foreign country. And we used the practice of interviewing the employee and the spouse, and if they had teenage children, we also brought in the teenage children.
What a fantastic idea and concept. I think this would benefit everyone, including the organization itself.
I think based on that experience, I can honestly say that that was an excellent investment, because it meant that the settling in process was much, much shorter. And the ultimate effect was that people knew ahead of time what to expect. And the other thing that developed with that was that we had families that learned to live together. And so there are a number of families where the children, let's say, are still friends.
Very good. I think it's also just the buy-in, by educating the family, the spouse, the children. You get buy-in when they understand what they're going to be living.
And there is an intercultural educational program that goes on in addition to, and this was an educational project, but in addition to that, the families and the children who went through that system, and who many of them went through the international school.
Okay.
And some of those people, for example, are now second generation involved in education. And one of them happens to be the president of Nipissing University.
Very good.
So we do have a continuity ongoing.
Yes. Well, thank you for sharing, Isaac.
I'm really interested to understand and know a little bit more about the types of families that you helped integrate into the different communities.
Yes, I can give you, let's say, a couple of examples. First, I'll use the example of the Kenya Technical Teachers College project, where we brought a number of families from Canada to live and work in Kenya for some time. On that occasion, what ultimately developed was that there were a number of families who had children of various ages, but at about the same age, so that they developed almost a culture of their own, so that you could have Canadian families communicating with each other. And it did help tremendously when they were going to school and so on, and many of those people carried on. The other example I would use is in the Philippines, where we had, again, quite a large number of Canadian families coming to live and work. On that occasion, my wife became what we called the Canadian coordinator, and she helped the Canadian families coming to learn about how to get involved in the schools, about the new system and so on. And that ended up being very, very helpful as well. It meant that the children could become more quickly settled in, and that they could develop at least some of their own friends a little more easily than just coming into a strange country and a strange school system.
Right.
And that helps particularly with the younger children, because they develop friendships more easily.
Right. Yeah. Well, like we all know, as teenagers develop, they're needing their independence, but they're also needing to belong. So as a teenager, sometimes it's hard for them to adapt going into a totally new community. What's your take on that? Is there a right time, a wrong time?
Again, based on our experience, I would say that teenage children may find it very difficult to make the transition, because for them it's very difficult to give up friendships, because it seems that they think that they're giving up their friends forever, although we know that they're going to continue their friendships. But at the time it becomes extremely difficult. So teenagers find it very difficult to make the transition between cultures. Whereas with the younger children, they're more flexible, and they have much more opportunity to develop their new friendships when they move.
Yeah.
But for teenagers, it can be very, very stressful.
Right. And it's very stressful for the parents, because here they see their child, teen, isolating themselves, withdrawing. I mean, seeing your own child get depressed and or suicidal because they're not fitting in and belonging, not wanting to get out of bed in the morning. You have your stress of the relocation, and then you have the stress of seeing this poor child suffering. Now that must be really hard.
Yes, and that's where it becomes difficult, and it's not always possible for teachers and parents to have the time to understand what the children are going through, particularly, again, the teenagers, because it's very stressful moving between cultures. And adults have different coping mechanisms. Teenagers, generally speaking, find it more difficult. Yes.
Yeah. So when you move, choosing to move, like one of the things I spoke about earlier was, being aware, being proactive, trying to understand before you go, because sometimes it can look quite romantic going on a new posting or going to a new country, but there's a lot of different issues that need to be thought about, and this is just one that we've been speaking of.
Yes.
Yeah.
So my advice to the organization, the employer, pay particular attention. The bottom line is, if the employee is going to be effective at work, the family has to be more effective in the intercultural transfer. And so for that reason, I highly recommend that the family should be interviewed, not just the employee, and that briefings before the posting, and of course attention during the posting as well, to the family rather than just to the employee.
Right. Good advice. Okay. Great. Good. Thank you.
So Kathy, one of the things we've been talking about, we've talked about how families can experience problems and sometimes they need support. And sometimes it's been my experience that they need support that's more formal and more professional than what friends or family can offer. And I also pointed out that when you're overseas, because you're living in this fishbowl existence, you're often reluctant to seek local support, local professional support of a counselor, for example, because of privacy issues, and you're afraid of everybody knowing about your personal life. And I was wondering if you had experience working remotely with families or individuals and couples, and if that's a possibility, if in fact people can relate to a Canadian service or a Canadian counselor.
Oh, absolutely. A lot more people are reaching out and doing that over Skype or FaceTime, because just as you said, they're afraid of being, they're
exposed.
They're exposed, totally.
Yeah.
So, and also it's a cultural thing. So if you're in a different country, the culture of the therapist there may not understand what you're experiencing, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So then if you have a therapist who's the same culture, then you can understand and work together. But it's becoming a lot more known that people will reach out that way.
And I think that's really important for our members, to realize that there's help out there, and sometimes there's they can connect back to Canada to get that help.
Absolutely, yes.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Okay, thank you.
This is only the beginning of a discussion on these complex issues. We don't have all the answers, nor do we have all the questions. So we invite you to join us. Send us your comments, your questions, and your observations. Spouses Without Borders can be a lifeline. We can direct people to professionals like Cathy Lumsden. Keep in mind that there are many others that have gone through the same thing that you have gone through and are going through, and that you can share your experiences. They'll be happy to share their experiences with you and maybe provide some guidance. You can reach out to us by email. Join us on our forums on Facebook, LinkedIn, and Twitter. You can also look at our website. And thank you. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today. Cathy, Kathryn, and Isaac.